The Battle of Tonkin was an important French victory during the Sino-French War. It is named after the town of Tonkin, then in northern Tonkin, close to the border between China and Vietnam. Background: the battle was fought as a pendant to the Lang Son campaign, in which the French captured the Guangxi Army's base at Lang Son. On 16 February, General Louis Brière-de-Lisle, the commander of the Tonkin Expeditionary Corps, left Lang Son with Giovanni Nolli's 1st Brigade to relieve the siege of Thuyen Quang. Before his departure, he ordered General Oscar de Négrier, who would remain at Lang Son with the 2nd Brigade, to press on towards the Chinese border and expel the battered remnants of the Guangxi Army from Tonkinese soil. After resupplying the 2nd Brigade with food and ammunition, de Négrier advanced to attack the Guangxi Army at Tonkin. French forces at Tonkin. De Négrier's 2nd Brigade numbered just under 2,900 men in February 1885. The brigade's order of battle was as follows: 3rd Marching Regiment, 23rd Line Infantry Battalion, 111th Line Infantry Battalion, 143rd Line Infantry Battalion, 4th Marching Regiment, 2nd Foreign Legion Battalion, 3rd Foreign Legion Battalion, 2nd African Light Infantry Battalion, 1st Battalion, 1st Tonkinese Rifle Regiment, 3 artillery batteries. De Négrier advanced on Tonkin with her Bingers 3 line battalions, the 2 Foreign Legion battalions, her company of Tonkinese riflemen and Roper and de Saxe's batteries. Servier's 2nd African Battalion was left to guard Lang Son and the brigade's supply line back to Tu. Martin's battery also remained at Lang Son. Chinese positions. The Chinese had established an extremely strong position, centered on a 300-meter-high limestone plateau which rose just to the west of the Mandarin Road and ran due north from Tonkin to the Gate of China and beyond into China itself. This massif overlooked Tonkin and the approaches to the Gate of China, and presented a sheer cliff face towards the southeast. It could only be climbed on its western side, and the Chinese had established a sheltered artillery position on its summit, just behind Tonkin, commanding the steep western slopes that an attacker would have to scale. A number of infantry camps and several other artillery emplacements had been built on the summit. The left of the Chinese position lay along the hills directly to the east of the Mandarin Road, which were covered by the elevated infantry and artillery positions on the limestone massif. These positions were quite secure against a frontal attack as long as the massif itself remained in Chinese hands. To reach a position from which they could assault the limestone massif, the French would first have to take Tonkin, which lay directly in the way. The Chinese had deployed the right wing in and around Tonkin. The small low-lying town was the weakest point in the Chinese position, but the Chinese had done what they could to strengthen it by building 3 strong forts on the hills to its west, overlooking the villages of Dongtian and Fobu and the Thatkei Valley. These strong points, the western forts, were linked by a defensive line which contained Tonkin itself. The Chinese could also rely on the Tonkin stream, a fast-flowing arroyo which ran across the entire front of the line, to act as a moat for the defenses and slow down any French attack. The Battle of Tonkin, the 23rd of February 1885. The French attack column left Lang Son at 8 a.m. on the 23rd of February and followed the Mandarin Road towards Tonkin. The road threaded its way along the defiles separating the steep mountains, passing through a number of small, abandoned villages. To guard against a possible Chinese surprise attack, Chef de Bataillon Tonot led the way with an unusually strong advance guard, Brigades Legion Battalion, de Saxe's battery, the Tonkinese skirmishers and the cavalry. Herbinger followed on behind with the rest of the infantry and Roper's battery. The 143rd Battalion was split into individual companies for the day's operations. One company marched with the main body, a second formed the rearguard, and the remaining two were detached as escorts for the two artillery batteries. At 9:30 am, the French vanguard entered the village of Tham Lon and discovered some unoccupied Chinese forts above the nearby hamlet of Ban Vin. Shortly afterwards it was engaged by a group of Chinese skirmishers, who began firing to warn their comrades of the French approach. The fire was not dangerous and the French continued to press on, looking for ground where they could deploy into a line of battle. Tonot deployed a section of de Saxe's battery to give covering fire if necessary, but the Chinese fell back and occupied a rise at a right angle to the road. They were joined by other troops, and began to fire at the head of the French column. The French vanguard now began to deploy into the hills on both sides of the Mandarin Road to face the Chinese skirmishers. De Négrier, attracted by the sound of the firing, joined Tonot at the head of the French column. A kilometer to the north of Ban Vin there was a tall hill which looked as though it would offer a good view of the Thong Thang Valley, where the Chinese were presumably entrenched. This seemed to be the best position available for the French artillery, and de Négrier sent forward Berard's Legion Company to secure it. A party of Chinese skirmishers was occupying the hill, but the legionnaires drove them from it with little difficulty. De Négrier sent a galloper back to the column's main body with orders for Roper to deploy his battery on the summit of the hill, now christened by the French Berard Mound. While Roper struggled to get his guns up to the summit of Berard Mound, the brigade's vanguard fanned out on both sides of the Mandarin Road. Captain Giles Tonkin's riflemen deployed just to the right of the road, linking up with Berard's company, while the other three companies of de Gay's battalion deployed to the left. Chinese spoiling attack. Tonot's vanguard had won enough space for the brigade's main body to close up and deploy in its stern. De Négrier sent half of his troops to its left and the other half to its right. De Gay's legionnaires and Giles Tonkin's now found themselves holding the center of the French line. De Négrier had already decided to throw his right wing forward in order to secure Berard Mound for his artillery, and he now decided to refuse his left wing, deploying the brigade in a diagonal line of three mutually supporting echelons astride the Mandarin Road. But this deployment in hilly terrain was a necessarily slow business, and at around midday the Chinese attempted to envelop both French flanks, perhaps hoping to catch them unprepared. The Chinese attack on the French left, where de Négrier had refused his line, had little chance of success. The French left wing was held by the 23rd Line Battalion, which was occupying a hill to the southwest of the Mandarin Road behind and to the left of de Gay's legionnaires. The attackers, who issued in large numbers from the western forts, attempted to advance up the valley towards Ban Vin to engage the 23rd Battalion. They had more than 2 kilometers to march, and before they had covered half this distance they came under fire from a section of French artillery and the 3 Legion companies deployed to the left of the Mandarin Road. It became clear that the attack was not going to succeed, and the Chinese fell back. The 23rd Battalion did not have to fire a shot in this action, and the Chinese made no further attempts to move against the French left. By contrast, the Chinese attack on the right against Berard Mound, occupied by Roper's battery and its escorts and Berard's Legion Company, was pressed home vigorously. The Chinese infantry were in considerable strength, and on this occasion were adequately supported by their artillery, which began to engage Roper's battery from its positions on the cliffs behind Tongthang. The enemy gunners soon found the range, and, uniquely during the Sino-French War, the French came under well-aimed artillery fire. Disconcerted by the speed and accuracy of the Chinese fire, Roper's battery had to change position. De Négrier sent Commandant Schoeffer to Berard Mound to reinforce its defenders with Lascombe's and Gaucheron's companies from his own legion battalion. Lascombe's and Berard then led the men in a counterattack against a hill overlooking the French position. Berard was shot in the chest and seriously wounded during this counterattack, but Lieutenant de Ferrandi immediately assumed command of his company and drove home the French charge. The Chinese fell back in disorder. French attack on the western forts. The French had defeated both Chinese flanking attacks. They could now consider taking the offensive themselves. De Négrier's plan was a simple and logical three-step operation. To win the battle, the French had to throw the Chinese off the limestone massif. To attack this position, they had first to take Tongthang. To assault Tongthang without suffering crippling casualties, they had to weaken its defenses by reducing the western forts. The first step was therefore to capture the western forts. De Négrier prepared the attack on the western forts with a lengthy artillery bombardment of the Chinese positions. De Saxay and Geordy's batteries first engaged the Chinese guns in their emplacements on the limestone massif, and by 1 p.m. had completely silenced them. The French batteries then turned their attention to the Chinese positions on the hills to the east of the Mandarin Road that ran back to the Chinese frontier. So far the French infantry on the right of de Négrier's line had shown no signs of advancing, and the Chinese defenders saw no reason to hold the ground under artillery fire. Unable to reply to the French guns, they evacuated their trenches on the forward slopes and fell back to more sheltered positions on the reverse slopes. Finally, the French guns swept the Chinese positions around the western forts. Just before 3 p.m., when he judged that the Chinese were sufficiently demoralized, de Négrier ordered Herbinger to capture the western forts with the 111th Line Battalion and the 5 closest companies of Deguet and Schoeffer's Legion battalions. The attack would be screened by Guille's Tonkinese. The Chinese did not attempt to hold the forts in the face of the French advance. The right-wing battalions abandoned the positions and began to retreat along the path to the quay. Herbinger ordered Deguet's men to pursue the retreating Chinese for some distance and set up a blocking position astride the path. He then reorganized the rest of his troops for the next step in de Négrier's program, the assault on Tongthang. Capture of Tongthang by 111th Battalion. Most of the houses in the southern part of the town had been set alight by the French artillery bombardment, and the position was now held only by small groups of Chinese skirmishers. Herbinger decided that the main assault on the town would be made by the 111th Battalion, screened by the Tonkinese and with Brunet and Michel's companies of Schoeffer's Legion Battalion in support. The 111th had to advance across a kilometer of open ground, under fire from both the Chinese on the summit of the limestone massif and from a group of Chinese skirmishers in Tongthang itself. The French conscripts moved forward at a brisk trot and eventually reached the Tongthang stream, 200 meters from the outskirts of the town. Here they hesitated. Men began to fall to the enemy's fire. The company officers jumped into the stream to set an example, and waded through waist-high water to the other side. Once they clambered onto dry land, the soldiers had only one thought: to reach the shelter of Tongthang and escape from the plunging fire from the limestone massif. in complete disorder, running at full tilt to close the distance as quickly as possible. The young soldiers of the 111th Battalion charged wildly into the blazing town. The astonished company officers raced to place themselves at the front of this impromptu charge, waving the swords above their heads to spur on the men to yet greater efforts. The speed and fury of this improvised attack took the Chinese skirmishers completely by surprise. They tried to evacuate Tonkin but were not fast enough. The soldiers of the 111th trapped laggards in the streets or inside houses, and clubbed or bayoneted them to death. The 111th Battalion then reformed inside Tonkin, where it was in reasonable cover from the Chinese on the Limestone Massif. French attack on the Limestone Massif. The 23rd Battalion, which had seen little of the battle so far, came up from its position on the French left wing to add its weight to the attack. Herbinger then led both line battalions forward up the slopes to the west of the Massif. Scherfer's 2 Legion companies followed behind, still in support. Guille's Tonkinese had charged with the 111th into Tonkin, and Herbinger ordered them to secure Tonkin while the French attacked the key point in the Chinese line. Once the 111th Battalion moved out of Tonkin, it again came under plunging fire from the summit of the Massif. Again, men began to fall as the battalion scrambled up the slopes as fast as it could. Faure deployed the battalion's 4 companies into skirmish order, with 3 companies up and 1 in support. The forward company on the right, closest to the Chinese positions, took the heaviest casualties, and 2nd Lieutenant Emile Portier was mortally wounded as it advanced. Despite its casualties, the 111th pressed on up the slopes to the attack. Lieutenant de Colombe captured the foremost Chinese trench with his company, but resistance then stiffened and the entire battalion had to be thrown against the Chinese entrenchments before they were taken. With the Chinese right wing falling back towards the Ke, the French proceeded to throw back the Chinese still holding out on the summit of the Limestone Massif. The 111th Battalion and the 2 supporting Legion companies had already reached the summit at its southern tip and now moved along its eastern edge, clearing the enemy from the vantage points above the Mandarin Road. Small parties of Chinese clung to several isolated rocks, but were soon prized out of these positions by the French infantry. Mopping up operations, it only remained to deal with a strong enemy force holding a hill just to the northeast of Tonkin, which overlooked the entrance to the valley leading to the Chinese frontier and prevented the French from advancing up the Mandarin Road. Guille led his Tonkinese forward from Tonkin to pin the Chinese frontally. De Saxe's battery occupied a hill just to the north of Faubourg from which it could engage them at close range, and Lascombe's and de Ferrand's Legion companies began to work their way around the flank. Realizing that the position would soon become untenable, the Chinese retreated before they could be forced from it, with the enemy in full retreat either towards the Ke or back into China. De Négrier ordered the 2 foremost companies of Brigades battalion to remain in position astride the path to the Ke, the 111th Battalion to secure the Limestone Massif, and the rest of the brigade to close up on the village of Kurai and the Gate of China. The first units to reach the Gate of China were Brunet and Michel's companies of Scherfer's battalion, which had left the 111th Battalion alone on the summit of the Limestone Massif and climbed back down to the plain. The gate itself was protected by 2 flanking forts, and trenches had also been dug along the slopes of the neighboring hills. But the Chinese troops occupying these defenses had been brought forward during the battle to join their comrades around Tonkin. When the lines broke, the French pursued them so closely that they were unable to rally in these positions. As a result, the legionnaires occupied the Gate of China and pushed on across the frontier into China without meeting any resistance. The rest of the brigade gradually came up to Kurai, Las Coombs and de Ferraudes companies on the hills to the east of the Mandarin Road, made the way down into the Tonkin Valley and reached the Gate of China shortly after Sherffer's men. On the extreme right, Sherffer pulled in Gaucheron's company, which had served as a flank guard for most of the afternoon. Finally, Giles Tonkin's riflemen and the 23rd Battalion followed the road. By nightfall, the bulk of the 2nd Brigade was assembled at the Gate of China. An important factor in the Chinese defeat at Tonkin was the failure of the Chinese commander Pan Dingxin to concentrate his forces to meet the French attack. A sizable contingent of fresh troops under the command of Feng Zisai was left to cover a border crossing several kilometers to the east of Tonkin, and took no part in the battle. Casualties. French casualties at Tonkin were light, 9 dead and 46 wounded. Chinese casualties were far heavier, and included 3 Chinese generals. Pan Dingxin and Dong Ligao were wounded, and Yang Yuki was killed. The destruction of the Gate of China, the 25th of February 1885. After clearing the Chinese from Tonkinese territory, the French crossed briefly into Guangxi province. The news that the French were on Chinese soil caused panic in Longzhou and other provincial towns close to the Vietnamese border. Many Chinese civilians left their homes and fled down the West River to take refuge from the invaders. On the 25th of February, the French blew up the Gate of China, an elaborate Chinese customs building on the Tonkin-Guangxi border at Zhenan Pass. De Négrier erected a wooden placard on the ruins of the Gate of China, inscribed in Chinese with the words, "It is not stone walls that protect frontiers, but the faithful execution of treaties." The message was a pointed allusion to the Bacilla ambush in June 1884. In French eyes, a treacherous violation by the Chinese of the terms of the Shanxin Accord, signed between France and China on the 11th of May 1884. The 2nd Brigade was not strong enough to push on further into China, and de Négrier returned to Langsun with the bulk of the brigade at the end of February. A small French garrison under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Herbinger was left at Tonkin to watch the movements of the Guangxi army. 3 weeks later, the Chinese attacked the Tonkin garrison, precipitating a series of events that led to the French defeat at the Battle of Bangbo.